For this week's shipwreck video, we'll be making a return to an older topic. One of my earliest shipwreck videos was USS Lexington CV2, from when I was covering the major petrol discoveries, in particular, their looks at American aircraft carriers. For her part, Lexington was one of their best documented discoveries, covering a good portion of the ship herself as well as the debris field. It's for that reason that we've returned to this wreck. I've covered Lexington twice before. The first time, old as that video is, focused on the entire wreck site. The second, more recent look covered the well-preserved aircraft scattered around the wreck. That video gained a bit from its narrower focus compared to the original. I'm going to do the same today in focusing on the debris field. There's some interesting bits here, just like with Titanic. From technology you don't see anywhere else to some reminders of the human cost of war. A couple pieces really drive that point home. However, before we get to that, we have the usual brief overview of the sinking. In this case, USS Lexington, alongside Yorktown, participated in the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first aircraft carrier duel in history, with the final portion of the battle coming on May 8th. In this, Lexington would suffer heavily. Confirmed hits consist of 2 bombs and 2 torpedoes. The bombs did fairly minimal damage, but the torpedoes doomed the ship, through cracking her aviation fuel tanks, spreading fumes throughout the carrier. A spark, likely from an unsecured electrical generator, set off a massive explosion. More would follow, along with uncontrollable fires. Eventually, the crew was forced to abandon ship as the fires became too much. With the ship abandoned and suffering more explosions, USS Phelps pulled in and fired 5 torpedoes to scuttle the carrier. 216 men were lost with the ship, but 2,735 were rescued. Considering the damage, that is a very high number of survivors, a testament to the orderly evacuation and the prompt rescue efforts. From this point on, Lexington vanished into history. Her name would return to service with USS Lexington CV-16, the last Essex-class carrier in service and a museum ship to this day, which is actually a good point to make a quick side note. On these videos, I consistently see people crop in to go, "Nuh-uh, this ship is a museum." Do people not realize the Navy reuses names? I'm honestly baffled when I see those comments. I'm not gonna lie. That side note aside, however, Lexington's wreck remained undiscovered until relatively recently. The carrier was located on March 4th, 2018 by RV Petrol, as I mentioned at the start, on one of the last expeditions funded by Paul Allen before he passed away later that year. They found the wreck in 3 major pieces, but otherwise remarkably well preserved. The bow is, despite being on its side, fully recognizable as a Lexington-class bow. The same goes for the stern and the nameplate, while the main hull section, despite the missing stack and island, has some interesting weaponry. However, as I've covered that in a dedicated video, I'll leave things here for the main wreck. Now let's move to the debris field and the focus of today's video. We'll start with the biggest piece of debris in the form of the ship's island superstructure, or what's left of it. As we move on, I'll try to find pictures of the debris on the surface, or at least similar equipment, to compare to. With that said, Here we have the bridge. As you could probably expect, this is not exactly pretty. Petrol labeled this as the starboard side of the bridge, with this likely being the pilot house on the navigation bridge. Although you'd be forgiven for not being able to tell that in comparison to either blueprints or pictures of the area. Everything is a twisted mess of broken steel with only the windows really recognizable. There's various bits of scattered equipment as well, from cables to what looks like a ladder. If I'm not mistaken, this also looks like a view from the top of the bridge looking down, because this bit here looks like the blast shield on the surface, as you can see here. However, there's not much else I can make note of, so let's move on to the other picture of the pilot house. This one is from the front, as you can see in these pictures on the surface. It also appears to be a different angle on the previous picture, still showing the starboard side, although this area is in better shape. The windows, for example, are clearer. It also appears that the debris up here is from the same area as the last picture, including the cabling. The blast shield looks similar too, and this piece right here seems to be in both images, which appears to be the remnants of a light. Outside of those similarities, there's only a couple things I want to note. First, we have the conning tower here. This was noted on that blueprint earlier, and it's pretty intact aside from rusting, especially compared to everything above it. As for the second note, that's the interior of the bridge here. Unfortunately, between the debris and the overall wreckage, we can't see much of the inside. Though, just below that area, we do have some clear fire damage. This frame was scorched pretty badly. And above that, we have the final note. This large frame that's fallen over the bridge. Where it originated, I can't say for sure, but it's the largest piece of debris aside from the bridge itself, at least in this area. That also wraps things up here with the next two pictures switching to the tripod mast, which is just as much of a mess. You have the remnants of the fire control station front and center, which seems to have been torn apart as much of the window frames are missing, with twisted metal all that remains. Below that, you also have some sort of debris resting on top of it, stretched out from the control station to the one mast leg still visible, with all of this resting atop the island, or what's left of it. Frankly, there's not much detail to make out here. The most recognizable and intact bit is the doorway. The next picture, for its part, is a bit better in showing where the 8-inch directors used to be. It's pretty messy here, with some collapsed windows in the center. More of the mast leg is also visible right beside that area. But beyond that, there's not much to say, aside from this X-shaped bit here. I've seen that described as the base for a radar, but again, I'm not sure. Either way, that rounds things off here, with this picture being the last look at the bridge. There's not much to say other than that more of that frame we saw earlier is here, with the rest of the area pretty torn up, as you could expect, for being where the bridge broke from the hull. That said, there's not really much in the way of detail. As such, it's time to move to the smaller debris. Well, in the case of the next two pictures, not that much smaller, as these are two sections of the flight deck that detached from the main piece. I won't linger long here because not much is recognizable. The first of the two images is the larger piece, but there's not a lot here, some of it folded over in the background. And you can also see the side of the flight deck here, meaning this part broke off from the side of the ship. There's also some intact deck planking, which hasn't burnt or rotted away, though most of it seems to have been destroyed in the sinking or the years since. The other picture, meanwhile, is a closer-in look. There's still not a whole lot to see here, aside from more deck planks and hull plating in the background. With one notable exception, in this electrical base plate here. Petrol notes the ROV identified this part as coming from ahead of the funnel. Unfortunately, while a lot of guesses were made on what this powered, there wasn't really a consensus. If anyone has any idea, by all means toss it in the comments. Without more context clues, I can't say myself. Regardless of what it is, this is still an interesting piece of debris, especially with the cables. In any event, though, it's time for the proper debris, not large pieces of the hull that happen to be in the debris field. Starting here with one of Lexington's boilers. It seems fitting, considering the most famous debris field is definitely Titanic's, and the first find there was a boiler. This boiler is of a much different design, of course. A 3-drum Yarrow boiler with its outer casing destroyed. It's also resting on its side, as the large drum at the bottom should actually be at the top, as you can see here on an older model of the same design. Still, aside from the orientation and the missing case, this is in one piece, even if the other drums show more visible damage. As for the next set of pictures, these all relate to a detached 20mm cannon mount. And I do need to emphasize mount for 2 reasons. First, the actual cannon is missing, and second, the entire mount and the area it was mounted to fell away. There's very clear damage here, while the other parts where it directly broke away are surprisingly intact. That goes for the mount as well. The gun shield is pushed up and the weapon is missing, but the mount itself, it's in more or less one piece, even down to the tag on the side, as you can see here. It's definitely faded, but a good portion is still legible nonetheless. Now, as far as I can tell, Petrol didn't find the barrel for this mount, but they did locate an ammunition drum nearby, complete with a rusted bullet, or shell as this is a cannon, still fixed inside. In fact, aside from some rusting over here, the drum is in excellent shape, considering how long it's been underwater and the light construction. This is even more apparent on the next picture with a blast shield detached from the hull. Much like the mount earlier, it has clear writing to read, along with the paint still being visible. That said, let's move on to a new picture, one of the most important for how underwhelming it might look. Lexington's CX-AM-1 radar. This is noteworthy because not a single one of these sets survived today. They were early radars and either replaced on surviving ships or sunk in the early war. There's very few surviving images even because of wartime sensors, such as this one on USS Ranger. That makes this look on the bottom a very rare sight indeed. About as rare as this picture, which is one of the torpedoes fired at Lexington to scuttle her. Clearly, in classic early war American fashion, this was a dud. It's also the last strictly military picture on this wreck. The remaining 3 are more personal, starting here with a welder cart, surrounded by mud and rust, but in mostly one piece. This was likely used on the hangar deck, if I had to guess, or wherever else the crew needed it. Which brings us to the final two pictures. First, a toolbox resting end up on the bottom. This is incredibly personal, a reminder of the men who served aboard the ship, as is often the case with pictures like this. Someone was using this quite possibly the same day Lexington sank, and it fell from the ship as she broke up, somehow remaining intact all the way down. Yet, for all of that, I think the final picture is the most personal of them all. An instrument resting almost entirely alone, from Lexington's band or a crewman's personal supply, where it fell to the bottom and landed almost peacefully in place. The ladder above it is the only other recognizable debris here, but it doesn't have quite the same impact as this instrument. Just like similar finds on Titanic, it really drives home the human cost in a wreck, be it at war or peace. And it's a fitting image to end this video on, I think. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.